and gentlemen, our world today is a world with one global superpower, the United States of America, and two other nations trying to become global superpowers, China and Russia. This challenge to the US's position as a sole superpower represents a risk to the entire world, because a world with one dominant global superpower is preferable to a world with many. A global power is a nation with the ability to exert significant influence and control on a worldwide scale across political, economic, and military realms. While not explicitly mentioned in the motion, it is also important to define unipolar and multipolar world. To put this in a simple way, a unipolar world is one with only one single superpower, and multipolar world is one with multiple superpowers. Before I begin our burdens, I must note that this case is not a defense for only one superpower. Example given relating to the end of the Cold War would apply equally had the Soviet Union won. So the burdens of this debate are simple. Proposition advocating for a unipolar world must prove that such a world has greater tangible benefits to the world. Its countries and their citizens than a multipolar world. Opposition defending a multipolar world must prove that the opposite, that multipolarity provides greater benefits than unipolarity. I will provide two main arguments, and then my partner will provide a third. The first argument would be that one dominant power helps to reach greater stability. Our first argument is that having a single superpower keeps the world safer from violence. This truth is born throughout history, in which great periods of peace are named for the single superpower that brought them about. No, thank you. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, the Pax Mongolica, the Pax Britannica. Today, we live through the same such period of peace, the Pax Americana. Now, make no mistake, Proposition is still well aware that we are on wars on Earth, and there have never not been wars. In a world with only one superpower, that superpower acts as a global policeman, intervening in budding conflicts to hasten its ends. In doing so, the single world power prevents that war from claiming many lives. And let's ask a question here. Why multiple competing powers take away greater stability? This is for three main reasons. Number one, in a multipolar world, the superpowers fight each other either directly in a world war or through proxy conflicts, both of which increase the number of death in war. Superpowers are incentivized to take up opposing sides of any budding conflicts and thus exacerbate war. And then the last reason is because, specific example taken, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the number of battle deaths dropped from 5 deaths per 100,000 people in the early 1980s to almost 0 death per 100 people in the 2000s. Now, why does this matter? I'm sorry. I'll take you later. Deaths are bad, and number two, the world is better if there are fewer wars and if more people live. And greater stability, as brought on by a single superpower, makes it more likely. Proposition's world is the world in which a Cold War fears of nuclear annihilation at the hands of competing rivalries between the US and the Soviet Union, or any other two superpowers does not exist. The opposition's world is one which the fears are constant and endless. Moving on to the second argument, which is the peace dividend. Our second argument is the natural outcome of the first. The peace dividend is the economic benefit to a country that comes about from the reduction of militarization as a result of peace. Put simply, when a nation experiences a period of relative peace or a shift in global dynamics, that reduces the need for extensive military spending. And so, I'll take you later. The resources that were previously allocated to defense can be redirected to other areas of the economy. This relocation of the resources is called the peace dividend. This idea gained traction following the end of Cold War, and for good reason. With the fall of communism, many nations no longer have fear of communist invasions and could cut defense spending. A prime example here is West Germany, who, without the threat attack by East Germany or the Soviet Union could relax militarily spending and use that money to economically and socially integrate East Germany with West Germany, into West Germany. And again, why does this matter? Is because a peace dividend means significantly more money going into people themselves instead of to war. This benefits the population by increasing the national benefits given to them. And alternatively, the peace dividend can also manifest in tax cuts, which lead to greater citizen spending and substantial stimulation of the economy. Yeah. We can also look at the UK, who went from spending 8% of their GDP on the military in the 1950s to 2% today. And the corresponding rise in spending on the health service from 3% in the 1950s to 7% in 2019. I'll take your cue.
So how does the UK play into this fact of having multiple awards or unipolar awards?
This will be mentioned later on in other speakers. Okay, so now moving on to preemptions. Before ending my speech, I would like to give some preemptions for arguments opposition is likely to run first. First, opposition will probably make an argument in some way related to unipolar superpowers, crushing countries with different economic or political systems and enforcing a single ideology in other countries. However, this is not the case. The truth of the matter is this enforcement of a single ideology occurs in a multipolar world. For the US in the 70s, one country becoming communist meant a gain in the power for the Soviet Union and a loss in the power for the United States. However, now, in our unipolar world, a country becoming communist does not threaten the US because it is the sole global power. Thus, the US can leave that nation alone without fear of another superpower's rising influence. In fact, the US allies with many local ethnic militias in Myanmar against the ruling military of junta. Many of these militias are anarchists or communists politically. So the United States wouldn't have allied with such communists during the Cold War. Opposition may also run arguments that in some way cherry-pick contemporary wars, acts of aggression caused by the United States. Neither side of this debate could end all wars, and any global superpower will be involved in some war. However, in a unipolar world, these wars are not as extreme and do not kill as many people. And that is why we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay, we'll hear from the opposition side. First speaker.
I would like to start rebutting what side proposition just brought forth, but the real rebuttal here is that side proposition is justifying imperialism and colonialism just because it's supposed to bring greater civilization to depressed countries. But this is so wrong. This is the idea. This is the fake idea at the base of colonialism. The real intent has always been economical gain. So other than that, the first thing I'd like to point out is that the proposition hasn't brought no model, no characterization, no mechanization for which their world brings significant tangible benefits to their stakeholders. So other than this, I would like to point out that their characterization of the Pax Americana that we live in right now, so a unipolar world where it's safer from violence, contradicts with the status quo, where actually there are several conflicts going on in the world. So this is also a wrong point. Another point that was brought forth that is incredibly wrong is the drop of the number of deaths after the Soviet Union, during the Soviet Union regime. Because according to them, this proves how a unipolar world brings tangible benefits in terms of human life. But first, they don't understand that that was a regime, and second, they ignored the fact that the 20 million people died from hunger. No, thank you. The second argument also contradicts, and especially the example of West Germany, also contradicts their side, because West Germany was said to have increased its economical influence when it was separated from its Germany that was under a unipolar world, and this proves that a unipolar world doesn't bring tangible benefits to the economy. Other than not providing any mechanization of why the enforcement occurs in multipolar world, no, thank you. We don't understand how side proposition proves anything they say. So moving on with our case. The burden of our team is demonstrated that the status quo, which sees the prevalence of multiple competing powers, doesn't need to be changed. Yes, the status quo is far from being perfect, but still, it's preferable to side propositions model. As a matter of fact, today's trends are quite promising. The main preferable aspect of the status quo is the competition and progress. The competing of many powers, in a second, try to overtake the others, inevitably leads to progress. Each country will try to beat its rival system of government, of economy, making groundbreaking advancements in the field of knowledge. Proposition is unethical and inapplicable, but even if that was achieved by proposition, it will bring the world back to imperialism, something that always managed to self-destroy. The result, we will be turning back to the status quo, but in the meantime, we have lost time, resources, and human lives. The competition that allowed dominant countries to overthrow the colonizers means real progress. The national conscious that was achieved through imperialism. So, our team is based on the fact there are three issues that will, in a second, that will arise from side proposition world, but before presenting it, sure, I'll take a
Is the world currently unipolar or multipolar?
There are it's a multipolar world. There are several competing countries. There's not a unique, it's not a unique power, as you said, like the US said. You can't characterize the status quo as it is. First argument, a single dominant power is unethical. Two levels of characterization, the ineffectiveness and the illegitimacy. The problem with propositions world, as far as ineffectiveness is concerned, it doesn't solve any problem. It's unjust to the states that are subjected. A single state cannot guarantee a common good for the whole world. In fact, political or economic imposition by one state on the others ends up not resolving any problems in the subjugated countries. On the contrary, it creates further issues. It's impossible for one state to do the good for the whole world. Take, for example, Protagoras. Idea of cultural relativism, the principle for which, if you ask the people to vote for the best law, they will choose theirs. And the same idea for which traditions that belong to a certain people will be inapplicable to another. So intervention. Another example is the intervention of the US in Afghanistan to export democracy, as they said, despite being passed off as an action of freeing the Afghan people from the oppression of the Taliban, was found to be the strenuous attempt to impose in a country not ready yet and mature a form of government foreign to it. The result was civil war and the creation of terrorist cells hostile to the West. How a world with several powers does not present this problem? Because there are specific target areas related to specific needs and requirements, so each regional local power focuses just on those specific needs and the good that is relative to these people, so it can satisfy specific needs. Second level of analysis is illegitimacy. The problem with proposition world is that it's ethically unjustifiable and oppressive and violates, first, every state's right to self-determination, and second, the individual right to liberty. The right of a people to self-determinate is a cardinal principle in modern international law as stated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says that people, based on respect for the principle of equal rights and fair opportunities, have the right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no interference. Other states would lose their political decision and economic authority in court facing homologation. So not guaranteeing self-determination would compromise the territorial integrity and political unity and sovereignty of a country. How a world with several powers does not present this problem? Because every state's right to self-determination is guaranteed, individual right to liberty is guaranteed as well, because each individual would have the chance to pursue the world good. Second argument is that proposition war is inapplicable because a multipolar world prevents corruption, economic disparity, and erosion of cultural difference that would arise from a single dominant power. First, corruption. A problem with props world is that absolute power can't be wielded without coercion. So nations' income nations become through dictatorship, they will have absolute powers, and this is because of the principle of centralization of policy, that leads to dictatorship. Absolute powers corrupts absolutely because of the lack of accountability, the sheer availability of wealth, power, and coercion that makes corruption so easily, and the psychology for which every individual or national mentality that enables global determination is the same, are the same attributes that underpin corruption. The second is the exclusion of certain countries from the economy. Because the problem with proposition world is that centralized authority were to take over, it will be impossible to ensure that no other country is left behind. So why do you want to prefer our world at the end of this debate? Because in our world, a readjustment of power wouldn't cause a massive global conflict, and there wouldn't be an indispensable state who everybody seeks to replace. For example, when the UK left the European sphere of influence, the economy crashed, yes, but it didn't cause World War III, which is the main risk you have on side proposition world. Thank you.
All right. From the second speaker on the proposition side.
I will begin this speech by first providing some rebuilding of my partner's two presented arguments. I will then provide some rebuttal before moving on to proposition's third major argument. So, on the matter of stability, on the matter of our argument of stability, opposition has clearly made a fundamental misunderstanding, a disagreement with a misunderstanding on what it means to be a superpower. When asked if they considered the USSR to have been a superpower, they said, no, it is a regime. What does that even mean in this case? The fact of the matter is that the USSR during the Cold War was absolutely and undeniably a superpower. So let's move on. We now have to ask the next question. Was there more stability during the Cold War or during the current day, where there isn't the USSR and where the US is the only superpower? I know that side opposition disagrees with that assertion, and I will support it in one moment. So, is there more stability now, or was there more stability during the Cold War? The answer to this question is incredibly basic, and it is simply look at how many coups happened and how many worked during the Cold War. The majority of successful coups that have happened since World War II happened within the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War takes up the majority of the time, but even by year, successful coups trend towards the past. As time has progressed, the number of successful coups has gone down. Why is this the case? Because there is greater stability under a unipolar world. Now, I will move on to the concept of the peace dividend. Instead of tackling the idea of the peace dividend directly, go ahead.
So you're arguing that in today's world we have a unipolar system?
Absolutely. I will justify that in 1 minute. Allow me 1 minute and I will give justification for that statement. So, instead of engaging with the actual arguments within the peace dividend, they took a problem simply with the example of West Germany. It's true, West Germany's economy did take a hit when they integrated East Germany. But how could they take a hit? Why was their economy not completely destroyed? And the reason is that they defunded their own military. They spent less on their military and had more money to integrate East Germany. They were able to take that hit because of the peace dividend. So your opposition to our example is in fact support of our main arguments. Now, there are a couple of statements that were made that must be noted immediately. First of all, in opposition's opening statement, they said that our side is justifying imperialism on the basis of bringing civilization to other countries. We have literally no idea where that came from, that it was not said whatsoever in any of our speeches. It was absolutely not something that we had argued. Now, I now want to, they mentioned that we did not have a model. Of course we didn't have a model. This speech does not require a model. It is a belief argument, not a action argument.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that we live in a unipolar world, but are you aware that India is the fastest
I'm
economy in the
so
world,
sorry.
and
I
the
will-
USA will,
I will cut you off right
China
now.
will overcome.
I
the USA has
I
been-
will address this
Yeah.
right now. I will address this right now. So, can I support the statement that we live in a unipolar world right now? Absolutely. What is the world's strongest military? The United States of America. What is the next strongest military? China. China. How do these two militaries compare? I cannot stress this enough. The United States military is 6 times better funded and has more personnel. A 6 times difference is not something that exists within 2 equal superpowers. It is significant in this regard. So, what about economics? The United States is the strongest economy in the world. What's the second strongest economy in the world? China. What is the US's GDP? The US's GDP is several trillion dollars more greater than China's. How can you justify in this regard that China is, is it a rival to the United States? Absolutely. Does it have the possibility to become a global superpower in the future? Perhaps. But are they a global superpower right now? Are they a global superpower on the level of the United States right now? Absolutely not. The United States is the only global superpower at the moment. Now, I will go on to some rebuttal. Their first argument had to do with traditional imperialism, and we actually preempted some of the things they were going to say, such as the invasion of Afghanistan. So let's talk about United States military intervention in the world during the Cold War compared to now. After the end of the Cold War, the United States engaged in 3 military conflicts. The first invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the second invasion of Iraq. This sounds like a lot, but compare that to the Cold War, the invasion of Grenada, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the military coups in Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and Brazil, and Iran, and Guatemala, and Honduras, and Nicaragua. This is not even close in terms of amount of war. As we mentioned, side opposition is cherry-picking individual wars instead of looking at the actual statistical fact that there are fewer wars and that the US is engaged in fewer wars than they were during the Cold War. Now, as for the argument of preventing corruption, you seem to now be arguing that a global superpower has to be a dictatorship, because that is the only way by which you can justify the statement of individuals wielding dictatorial power. The United States is not a dictatorship. It is absolutely not the world's best democracy, but it is a democracy. And so the idea that in some way a superpower has to be a dictatorship is absolutely nonsensical. It can be a dictatorship. Nobody is denying that a dictatorship is possible to become a global superpower, but the idea that it must be a dictatorship is absolutely incorrect. I will now move on to Proposition's third argument. And that is that having one dominant global superpower is preferable because it allows for a more unified global response to various threats. There are dozens of examples I could point to, but one of the clearest and best examples of this is the intervention in Somalia to prevent piracy. In 2009, the US put together an international task force called Operation Ocean Shield in order to put an end to Somali piracy. By the end, Somali piracy had dropped from almost 200 incidents in 2010 to almost nothing in 2014-2015. Another example here is NATO's response to the Bosnian genocide, in which the United States led NATO into stopping Yugoslav forces from committing a genocide against the Bosnian people. This is incredibly significant because Yugoslavia was a communist nation, and had the USSR still been there, they would have intervened in support of Yugoslavia. But without the USSR, the US was so much more easily able to step in and put an end to one of the worst genocides in the post-Cold War world. Now, I would like to finish with one other thing, and that is that you offered a POI during my partner's speech asking why the example of the UK is relevant, and I would like to address that here because I think it frames this debate very well. The reason the UK is relevant is that in the modern day, is that it represents a middling power, a country with some influence, but that is not a dominant global power. And yet, it benefits tremendously from their only being one superpower. They went from funding almost nothing, a very small portion to their health service, to funding almost 7% of their GDP going to the health service. Why? Because they didn't have to worry about the effects of the Cold War. And why didn't they have to worry about that? Because there was this peace dividend. The entire world becomes better when there is only one global superpower. And because of this, I am incredibly proud to propose. Thank you very much.
Okay, second speaker from the opposition side.
proposition team for totally misunderstanding the framing of the world that we know today. Obviously, it's impossible to assert that we live in a unipolar world. Why? Because the second speaker of proposition team himself has proven that two global powers, the USA and China, even though there are many more, of course, and I will talk about them, are competing constantly to reach the first position for military spending, first position for the economy. According to a report from The Guardian 2019, it is argued that China's GDP will surpass the GDP of the USA in 2030, in the year 2013. So of course, if this isn't competition, what is competition? This is obviously competition, and the entire characterization of the world that we know today by proposition team is wrong. And therefore, a few arguments that they've brought obviously collapse on themselves. Now, I would like to focus on the rebuttal of the points that were brought by the first proposition
TOI?
speaker. Yes, thank you.
All right. The United States is competing with China. I agree with that. The United States is also competing with Venezuela, Cuba, Iran. Are you going to argue that these are global superpowers?
Are you arguing? Oh well, okay, I'll answer that. So obviously, if I'll explain how a competition works in a global perspective. So if GDP of a country is attempting to surpass the GDP of another country, and those two GDPs are very, very close to each other, then obviously this is a competition. And both nations are global superpowers. You cannot deny that China has a great influence on the rest of the world. How can you deny that fact? It obviously has a great influence. We have debated about TikTok. If we talk about the competition between the metaverse and TikTok, and the US trying to ban TikTok to gain more traction in the economy, then obviously this is a competition because one nation is trying to obstacle the other. Now moving on to the... No, thank you. I would like to move on to the rebuttal of the points that were brought by the first proposition speaker and the second proposition speaker. The first argument that was brought was greater civilization for the people. So obviously, if a great power were to assert itself in an imperialistic manner, then this would cause presumably less violence. But I would like to ask your proposition team, how is oppression not violence in this context? Oppression means that when these huge global powers decide on peace treaties, decide on legislation, decide on policy without consulting the different populations, they are, one, going to choose whatever is going to benefit them personally, and two, are not going to respect the relativism of culture from every single one of these countries. So in both scenarios, this is a total oppression, and for this reason, it is not a cost that we are willing to pay to quote unquote improve the world. Now, second point that I would like to rebut is peace. Now, obviously, the first proposition speaker brought the example that having one dominant global superpower would be able to would render defense spending a minor issue. So people would spend less on defense spending. 2 points of rebuttal on this. First one is, how do you think that a global superpower is going to exercise its influence on the entirety of the world without using violence? Because as we know, as the USA that you've brought as supposedly a model, has such tense relations with the Middle East that they will never be able to work with them peacefully. So this leads to the second point of rebuttal. Why do you assume that these populations that the dominant global superpower is willing to oppress will just simply sit there and take it? Do you not think that these people will rebel against the influence or the oppression of this dominant global superpower? If you truly think that, then I'm sorry, but it's completely wrong. Now, I would like to rebut one last thing, and then I will move on to my point. So, according to the model that was brought by the proposition team, this new global superpower would not impose its ideas on the globe. It would simply influence a friendly influence. Sorry for the repetition, but that is, again, completely untrue. How do you expect a dominant global superpower to intervene in conflicts, to intervene in policies, to intervene in every single thing without choosing one side or the other? This is obviously going to reflect its own ideologies. This is obviously going to mirror its ideologies in the world we know today. How is this not oppression, and how is this not unjustifiable? I would now like to move on to the third and last point of our team line, which is even in a world, if we manage to actually apply this system, it will not stick. As renowned German philosopher Hegel argued, history is characterized by the cyclic creation and destruction of the same dynamics. During the course of the first opposition speech, we have proven how the system proposed by proposition is unethical and inapplicable. But we would like to take our team line one step further, proving to you, even in the proposition's best case scenario, that plan would cause a world so full of contradiction that it will collapse on itself because of its own essence. So, two scenarios to take into consideration. The first scenario is the most pragmatic version, according to which the dominant global power would mindlessly abuse and exploit the countries under its control. In this case, the approach that the dominant power chooses to adopt directly clashes with the only reason that would supposedly legitimize the global power. So obviously, how would this global power keep developing countries obedient? Supposedly, they will help their economy. But how do you expect these global powers who have always abused... Yes, thank you.
You continue to come back to this idea that the only way you can express power is through military action. But what about soft power? What about political power? What about economic power? Why is military the only option?
I am not saying that military is the only option. I am saying that imposing your view and imposing your system of ideas when you are proposing a policy, legislation, or any type of peace treaty is still oppression, as it does not take into consideration the specific needs of the countries they're intervening for. So, by abusing developing countries for resources, as they've always done, they will be betraying the only way they might keep developing countries obedient, ensuring their well-being. Therefore, as philosopher Marx argued, the abused countries would eventually realize the horrible living conditions they have been subjected to. 2, they would rebel against the dominating power. And 3, they would attract further attention for the cause. They would coalesce, they would create a real revolution. The power of the global entity will be undermined, and the system of the unipolar world would crumble, returning therefore to the status quo. Your model in this first scenario returns to the status quo of a multipolar world. Second scenario, the historical fact that serves as the second scenario is correlated to a more idealistic image of this supposed global power. Even if this global power acted to protect interests of the developing countries that it was overseeing, this will still result in the return to the status quo. Allow me to demonstrate. 1, if a global power acted over countries ensuring their economic development, this would cause social development. Social development means the idea of the right to auto-government. So what would this bring? A revolution. This would, again, undermine the global superpower and turn it back again to the status quo. So why waste this time? Why waste this energy when we can improve the status quo that we have today of multipolar worlds with one simple operation, the better cooperation between global superpowers? Thank you.
Today, opposition had to do the following. They had to prove how our multipolar world would work, and they had to show how it would benefit humanity and how it would result in a net benefit. By failing to do neither of these, they've already lost this debate. What I'm going to be doing today is summarizing what has been done so far, and I'll be proving to you why this debate is useless and why we have already won it. So first of all, what happened is my mate, First Prob, went up, gave the definition, and for were mentioning that there was no model. That's normal because this type of debate does not require one, as mentioned by Second Prof. Then she had spoken about stability, she had spoken about peace dividend, and she had preempted that how having one superpower does not necessarily mean crushing all other political systems. something that opposition doesn't seem to understand. Secondly, how you cannot end all wars and how obviously war will always exist. We're not denying that. But what we are saying is that war are gonna be on a lesser scale. As when you have obviously the competition will still be between those smaller countries, but they're gonna be less powerful overall. What came next is first opposition, which came on and said a whole load of nothing. They have started by claiming that we want colonialism. No, we've never. And I'm gonna talk after why that is not the case. First, opposition spoke about how there is a lot of war now. That is not true. We are in the single most peaceful time in recorded history, and that is thanks to having a unipolar world. Thanks to the United States of America. God bless America. No. Then opposition has mentioned two main points. First of all, opposition started talking about imperialism, which is illegitimate, and gave the example of the USA Afghanistan invasion example. But to prove that they were not listening to any of what we were saying, this was already preempted by first proposition. She has spoken about how obviously you cannot end all wars, but they will be at a lesser scale. When you compare this to what was happening during the Cold War, there's not even a debate. Then obviously second prop came up and spoke about how obviously there is still there is still international action happening, and there are still coups happening, etc. We're not denying that. But again, compared to how the case was during the multipolar world, there is no debate, there is no comparison whatsoever. Then next, they had spoken about how corruption is rampant and how exclusion of countries might work. But second prop has already responded to those arguments, which I will be getting into. So, what second prop has started with is rebuilding. They began by talking about how stability is indeed better when you compare it to nowadays compared to the Cold War, which is the biggest, time in recent, memory and recent history where we had the multipolar world. The world is much more stable. The world is much more, just calm and more peaceful. Secondly, Peter had mentioned peace dividend, and he has proven why the Germany example that was brought up by first opposition is simply easily nullified, and also how whenever, and also how he has already mentioned how we are unipolar, and has proved that, and the fact that we are so obviously unipolar. No, how we are so obviously unipolar when you compare the USA to other countries. They destroy them in every single metric, every single one, pretty much, every single metric that constitutes what is a power. And so the fact that they say that we live in a multipolar world proves that they know nothing about politics.
So how are institutions which help collaboration, like for example, the United Nations or the European Union, contributing to this disastrous effect?
What? Could you please repeat your question? I cannot get
So
what this
you've stated that collaboration is what causes this entire damage, but how are institutions like the European Union and the United Nations contributing to this damage?
I have never said that collaboration causes damage. I don't know where you got that from. If you could please quote what I've said, please go ahead. I will continue with what I was saying. So second prop then moved to rebuttals. He has spoken about how as I mentioned earlier, there is not much international interference nowadays, which proves that the only thing that they know how to do is cherry pick examples that fit their narrative, a narrative that they know is wrong, hence why they seem to pick only these, very niche, very fringe examples. Next, he has spoken about how USA is not a dictatorship whatsoever. You may love, you may hate the USA. One thing is certain, it is a democracy. By definition, it is a democracy. It is the world-leading democracy. Go ahead.
Are you aware that China is still on the map? So we don't live in a unipolar world that China will overcome the USA in 2030 as the best economy in the world.
Okay, listen, I'll tell you what. The problem with opposition is they think that GDP is the only metric that has to be taken into consideration when talking about what a developed and what a superpower is. But that is not true. This proves that they only have a narrow vision when it comes to global politics. that shows how weak their argument is, how weak their preparation was, and how weak this side of the debate is. So perhaps China will someday overcome the USA, but when it comes to the other metrics, they are not even close. Next, the argument that second prop has put forth is that we will have a uniform response to every single global issue. He has given the example of Somalia, the piracy problem, when the USA actually took the responsibility and went to do the work. The problem was fairly fixed. Same thing with Bosnia, and this proves that opposition wants war. They keep talking about how no, there's going to be more war, there's going to be more deaths in our world. The truth is that is not true. That is what they want. Secondly, he has proved why the UK is relevant. That is because the UK is a country that is fairly developed but could not be considered a superpower. And what he has proven is that how they have gained from this unipolar world. Next, second up, came up and spoke about how it is impossible to be unipolar. He just proved that like 20 times already. There is no point in keeping on asking the same question. We have given the evidence. If we do not understand the evidence, we do not have any responsibility over that. Next, as I stated earlier, there is no competition whatsoever between the countries. Next, they did not respond to the POI of second prop. We've spoken about how since the USA also competes with Venezuela, Iran, etc., are they also to be considered global superpowers? Next, we have never mentioned civilization. You are misunderstanding our arguments, which was about stability. Also, a superpower does not necessarily have to be about oppression. You are misunderstanding what the definition of what a superpower is, and you are just antagonizing it in a way that is not fair. Then I'll move to our argument. We spoke about how having a unipolar world will not stick. Perhaps that is true, but that does not matter, because in this type of motion, this house prefers, not this house would. So we do not have to present a model of how it would actually work. Next, yes, that is all.
All right, first speaker from the opposition side, please. Take the podium.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, first of all, I want to refuse what has been said to the opposition team to the opposition team during all this debate. First of all, we clash on the main consideration of the unipolar or several competing global power world. Now, I'd like to say that the proposition tried to persuade us that we live in a unipolar world, and he totally forget the existence of China, the existence of Japan, the existence of India, the existence of Germany, France, the existence of the European Union, the existence of BRICS. These are all global competing power. They're trying to reach the hegemony on the world, and they want to focus on a data brought by the economists. For sure, China will overcome in 2030 the US as the first and best economy on the world. And the proposition team talk about GDPs, not my team. So they talk about GDPs, and we want to refuse them on GDPs. And China will for sure overcome the United States. I refuse. The United States are the first competing global power. So now, how we can define this world, which has several global powers, such as Japan, US, Germany, but the same European Union or the BRICS that are all economic power competing between them, how we can say that we live in a unipolar world. And for sure, the United States will lose their position of first dominant power. This means that they will lose it because there are several global power, dominant power, that are trying to, competing, and they want to be the first economy, and China is close to be the first economy. we don't want to mention all the other competing powers that I mentioned. We can only mention the United States and China. There are two blocks. There are two blocks that are competing, and that means that we don't live in a unipolar world. Unipolar, it's only one. We have at least two. It's not a unipolar world. Now I want to refuse all the argumentation that the proposition brought today. First of all, they want to keep peace with in this utopical unipolar world that it's not the world we're living in today, because the United States is not the only competing power, it's not the only global power we have today. But even if the United States were the only global power, they want to keep peace. They want to keep peace, and this peace will brought to stability. How this peace, if the United States were the only global power, and they want the stability only for their economical interest, how can all the other population of the world that are far from the view of the world of the United States want to be ruled by the United States? This is impossible. This can be considered as peace and stability. A world without unipolar power will only brings problems. Will only brings war, because all the country want to be under the power of the United States. And I want to bring a clear example. The United States itself. The United States gained their independence from the British Empire in 1776 because they want to be independent. They don't want to be ruled by another country that was far from their view, because they want economical and political independence. I refuse. This basically means that nobody wants to be nobody wants to live in a unipolar world, neither the United States. And the United States are found on independence, on economical independence and political independence. And now the proposition is trying to convince us that the United States won a world subjugated all the other countries, and the other country will just say, okay, you can do that. This is unacceptable, and this can bring peace. Now, they also bring an example of the Soviet Union. They say that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was stability, and the debts were passed from 20 million to almost zero. This clearly stated that a unipolar world such as the Soviet Union, that tried to be the only global power, cause debts, cause sufferance. When the Soviet Union collapsed, then we have several states, several governments competing them, and we have, of course, stability. In that case, we have stability with several dominant power, not with only one that tried to be superior to the others. Then we. So the proposition arguments falls on peace because of the example that I brought, and then falls on the economical benefits, because they also stated they also use this as an example, the fall of the Soviet Union. They say that after the fall of the Soviet Union, states, for example, the other part of Germany that was controlled by the U.S., they want an economical growth. Of course, they want it because they were in peace, and they were in peace in the moment that a superpower that tried to impose a unipolar world collapsed. In the moment that superpower collapsed, we have stability, we have economical benefits. So their example are basically sustain our opposition line. And now I want to focus on our opposition line. We say basically three main things. First of all, this model of a unipolar world is unethical. Is unethical because there are no benefits of being subjugated, and even if we can consider that we cannot, because as I said, we live in a multi-power and multi-global world because of all the association that we have in this world that competing each other economically and politically talking. And then, but even if we have the United States as a global power, the United States itself want to be want independence and they gain independence. So how you can say that being subjugated to another country brought to peace, brought to economical growth? This is absolutely astonishing. And then I also want to say that this will be unethical. This will be unethical. This won't bring any peace or economical growth. And the third option is that the statement of the proposition is they're clearly talking of a world that is like an imperialistic world with one power that wants to subjugate it with order force all the other power in order to maintain stability for only for their interests. They don't care about the interests of the nation that are subjugated, such as the country that are that were imperialistic, like the British Empire or the Roman Empire. They only want stability, but it's a fake stability because they only want self-interest and they want to grow their own economy, not the economy of the world. There is no stability, there is no peace, there are no economical benefits, and otherwise we will if the proposition win, we will have a regress in society. Thanks. I'm proud of you.
Proposition lost this debate the moment they stated that China and the US are competing, but still the US are completely dominant. The moment I realized we won is when I realized that side proposition compared on the same level the status quo with multiple competing powers and ongoing conflict, and the Cold War, especially the regime of the USSR, that represents everything proposition doesn't want in their world. So large-scale wars, military action, and not the use of soft power, no economic benefit, as in fact the Eastern Europe is still suffering from everything that have been going on during the USSR regime. This is exactly how we characterize a unipolar world. It's a world where large-scale wars happen, where stability is not stability, it's just something that looks like stability, but is oppression. People can't rebel because they're oppressed, because they're kept silent. But this is not the peace, this is not the stability we want. We want three main benefits that relate to the three issues that we brought forth relating to the world that proposition is supporting. First issue is the ineffectiveness, because what they're proposing doesn't solve the problems. It also creates more. It's unjust to the states that are subjugated to the unipolar world because the dominant power cannot guarantee the common good. It puts personal interests first, as it's obvious, and the varieties of cultures and political institutions of the world is hostile to the main power. So how can that be positive on their side of the house? The benefit on the stakeholders of as a global population is exclusive on our side of the house, because we characterize as the status quo it is. How many lives cost the status quo that goes on with the multiple conflicts? The second issue is the fact that their world is not inevitable because of the exclusion of economies, the erasure of the cultures, and the problem that this could lead to dictatorship. And misunderstanding that we said that a unipolar world is led by dictatorship, we did not say that. We said that it's a risk, that it can lead to dictatorship. How can we solve how do we solve the exclusion of economies? Well, you mentioned Cuba. Cuba did suffer from the unipolar world, from the global power as America. First, it suffered the exploitment of their resources, and then the embargo. In our world, we can't exclude countries from economies because we want to enlarge the alliances, to enlarge the influence. their system is a system that bounds to fail, as my second opposition speaker proved. As Marx's theory explained, the unipolar world will just result in the turning back to the status quo, which is exactly what we're proposing. So at the end of this debate, Judge, who will you prefer? Our world, a world that is safer for the global population and more stable and aware of the problems that it has, but that will work to resolve them, or a world that supports an imperialistic view of economy, of politics, of international relations, or just pretends to see it as something that is stabler, as something that is safer, as something that everybody agrees with. Thank you for your listens.
I want to start my reply speech by acknowledging the points where proposition and opposition agree. And that is that proposition and opposition are both working towards a world with less war, a world where fewer people die in war. Both sides believe that their case is the one that makes this argument better. Now here's why we believe that side proposition makes this case better. This comes down to a couple of main clashes, but the key one is that opposition does not understand the examples that they are using, and they do not understand modern history and how it impacts this debate. The idea that somehow the USSR represented a single unipolar world when it was competing against the United States is absolutely ridiculous. It is completely historically unfounded. The United States and the Soviet Union competed frequently. Now, you mentioned Cuba as a response to what we had said. And you mentioned how the United States treatment of Cuba is bad. I will acknowledge that the United States is treating Cuba not very good. But do you know the history between the United States and Cuba during the Cold War? In 1950, the United States invaded Cuba. Unless you're going to argue that an invasion of Cuba is somehow less bad than the admittedly not excellent economic blockade of the country, is an absolutely ridiculous thing to say, especially because Cuba is very well easily able to run that blockade. Now, I want to move on to a couple of other things. You mentioned that right now the current world is multipolar. It is multipolar. You mentioned China, Japan, Germany, France. And you focus on economics. I will focus on economics, and then I'll move on to other things. On the economic side of things, Japan. Is Japan an economic superpower? Well, they're the third largest economy in the world, so you might think that they are, but their economy is completely stagnant. They have not had GDP growth since the 1990s. In what way is zero GDP growth since the 1990s global superpower material? Let's move on to China. Okay, China has a rising economy. They also have a significantly falling working age population. Their population just declined for the first time last year. How can they keep economic growth when their working age population is no longer growing? China is facing a substantial economic hurdle in that case that the United States is not facing. Germany, France, both of these are incredibly weak economies when it compares to the United States. But let's move on from economy. If we look at the definitions presented at the beginning, a global superpower does not only include the economic realm, but also the political and the military realm. So none of these countries come close to the United States funding. In fact, if you add their military funding together, that result is still less than the United States military funding. How can you argue that makes any of them global superpowers when the fact of the matter is they're weak militarily when it comes to the United States? There is no country even remotely close to the military capacity of the United States. And let's move on. We can also talk about politics. Soft power is an incredibly important thing in the modern world. Even the United States Army says that the United States government prioritizes diplomatic, political, and economic engagements before they move on to military engagements with other countries. But how can we even follow this if you're going to refuse to talk about soft power and political power at all in the modern world? And the fact of the matter is the United States has more soft power than China does. China's neighbors are all incredibly weary of China and its constant expansionist attitude, whereas the United States has incredibly good relations with its immediate neighbors, with Canada and Mexico, and with the European Union. There are some problem areas, there are some areas where they have bad relations, but overall the United States' relationship with other countries is on average relatively good, whereas China's relationship with other countries is on average relatively bad. The fact of the matter is that the United States is the only global superpower, and so all of your arguments fall completely flat because they are made under the assumption that the current world is a unipolar world, and therefore they fail.